Je voudrais donc, pour la deuxième communication, passer la parole à M. Mamadou Sow, dont, je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, la communication est accentuée sur les conséquences des conflits en Afrique. Vous avez la parole, M. Mamadou Sow. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, dear members of this illustrious parliament. It's a great honor for me to come and speak to you as the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Southern Africa, but also as an African, as a brother who have worked in the last decade in many parts of our continent where there are armed conflicts and war. And in all these places I've worked in Africa, without exception.
Monsieur Sow, un instant. S'il vous plaît, c'est le canal 2 pour le français. Parce que je vois que c'est le canal 2. Peut-être Madame Hawa pourrait les aider parce qu'ils sont en train de chercher le canal de traduction. Allez-y.
So in all these conflict and war zones I have worked in the last decade in Africa, I have seen over and over and over women in the middle of this conflict when the situation are on the worst. I've seen them rise against hell and high water to protect themselves and their children, but I've also seen them often being part of the solutions. So I salute and I really send my deepest regards to our women across the continent. Why do I start with this? Because when I was invited to address this important gathering on silencing the guns, I said I will come to one condition, under one condition and one condition alone, and that there will be another woman who will be speaking in the same panel. But I understand that there was someone and that it's unfortunate that this person could not be here. But I think it's very, very important that we always have the voices of our sisters heard where decisions are taking place. So ladies and gentlemen, imagine that your village is attacked. Imagine your husband is arrested and your son is killed. Your daughter is abducted. That you run. This is now your new home. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's 50 degrees hot. You have no water, no electricity, no food, no health care. You are alone. Dear members of parliament, in many parts of our continent today, people don't have to imagine. This is their lived experience. Whether we are talking about parts of northeast Nigeria, whether we are talking about some parts of Cameroon, Mayasava, Mayasanaga, parts of Chad, Bagasola area, or parts of Niger, or South Sudan, or Central African Republic, or Mozambique, or Libya, or Burkina, the story is often the same. To be a parent in many parts of our continent today is to live with two permanent fears. One is that the family that you have, that you're not able to provide them with food and health care and education. Or worse, that family itself, that new bride that you have, that new son who just graduated from university and on whom lots of hope in the village lies on, or that daughter just learning to walk who makes you smile all the time. So you live with the fear that this family might be taken away from you in a blink of an eye. This man, I'm sharing the photo, his name is Bulama, and he's just standing and gazing over the burial of her daughter, Fatima. Ladies and gentlemen, this parliament we Africans we have work to do. We have work to do because every time a man decides to strap a bomb on a little girl, and this happened, I've seen it in many parts. Every time a man is being tortured, or every time girls are abducted, and we've seen this, or every time healthcare workers are killed in armed conflict, and this was the case of 2 of my colleagues just last year. I think the universe weeps, the star dims, and whether we know it or not, collectively, we all reach a new moral low point. We reach a moral low point because we Africans and humanity as a whole, we are one. A British poet said this feeling that I had many years ago. He said it very nicely. He said, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a part of the continent, or part of the main. At the end of the poem, he went on to say, every man's death diminishes me, because I am involved with mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Now, because we are one, because humanity is one, and Africa is one from the Mediterranean to Cape, from Dakar to the Horn of Africa, because we all are one, we need more people like you who have a great sense of moral consistency. Moral consistency means that if you have love for your children in your very quiet neighborhood, you should have that same love and hope for children in places as far as Mogadishu, as Bagasola, as anywhere that you don't necessarily see every day. It also means that next time you hear the word migrant or refugees, you remember that our love and our loyalty must lie to Africa as a whole, and not just those we very narrowly call often our own. I will tell you something that will maybe surprise you. In all these places I've worked, when humanity is at its lowest point, when the situation is profoundly difficult, it's actually when I have seen the most profound testament, the most profound manifestation of moral consistency. When the sounds of gunfire reverberated through that northeastern town of Baga in Nigeria, Saratu's mother took her daughter and sent her to the nearby lake on a boat, along with other escaping persons. She remembered that some of her children were not with her at the time. So she went back to the house to fetch the other children. By the time she came to the shores of the Lake Chad, the boat was gone, and so was Saratu. Now, one thing that always moves me throughout the places I've worked in Africa is how communities help one another long before the arrival of humanitarian actors, of the International Red Cross and others. I've seen this quite often, and what they do is they devise local strategies of survival. They rely on their own networks, and they devise some coping mechanism. For me, this is, they are the ultimate humanitarian workers. They are actually the greatest donors to our effort as humanitarian actors. If you want to see the best of African humanities, go there and see how communities interact with each other. A great example is in the Lake Chad region in Nigeria, in northeast Nigeria. Communities, they have welcomed and hosted 2.5 million people displaced by the war, by the Boko Haram crisis. and shared with them the very meager resources that they already have. For me, this is a tremendously timely contribution of Africans in today's world, a world that is bereft of acts of kindness, a world that lacks that collective sense of responsibility, a sense of moral consistency. I'll never forget this woman. I met her in Tumur, in Niger. I went in with my team to register her because they were displaced in the middle of nowhere and needed our assistance. So we sat and we registered her. And next thing I know, she went outside and she came dragging a goat. And she wanted to offer me this goat. And it took me longer to negotiate with her, longer than I have negotiated access with many armed groups, to convince her. Eventually, we settled for milk. What this lady was telling me is, yes, this armed conflict, this war that we have been going through, have made me a displaced person. It have robbed me of my home. It has robbed me of people whom I loved. But it cannot and will not be able to rob me with my own sense of hospitality, with my own sense of dignity. I think it was a very quite moving situation for us. Saratu, that I was talking about earlier. So, as a refugee, Hawa was living in the other side of the Lake Chad, in Chad itself. She was raising 6 children, 2 were her own, and 4 were other children from separated families. Hawa was just walking in Chad, near the lake, and saw a little girl crying on a boat. And she did not think twice. She took Saratu home in the IDP camp, in the refugee camp where she was living. And for 1 year, Saratu benefited from the loving care of Hawa. Eventually, my colleagues from the International Committee of the Red Cross were able to locate Saratu using pictures and names, and eventually we were able to reunite her again with her family in northeast Nigeria. Hawa is, to me, a living personification of moral consistency. Now look at these faces. Look at them very closely. I see these faces quite often throughout our continent, my friends. When you look at them, you don't even have the impression they live in a war zone. You see hope in their eyes, despite an unbearable situation. And often I ask them, and often I try to understand, and I've thought about it quite often. But what I have realized that is the hope that they cling on to is not necessarily a comparison or an analysis of their condition versus the odds. The hope that I see in the eyes of these people, in the eyes of these communities, is an affirmation of their humanity despite their conditions, despite the odds against them. It's, for me, a deeper level of hope, and I think it's the audacity of hope in these conditions. But at the end of the day, beyond food and healthcare and education, which we provide to the millions throughout Africa, beyond all that stuff, what these communities yearn for, what they want, what they desire, is peace, is the guns to be silent, is the ability to restore hope for themselves and for their children, and to be able to have a better future for themselves. I once read from Martin Luther King something that really moved me. He said, "Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, 'Too late.'" Yes, my friends, there is such a thing. as being too late. In today's horrifying conundrum of our shared humanity, I think complacency and apathy are the enemies to human progress. But love and selfless actions is what can sway the pendulum towards a better world. You can play. This is Saratu. I wanted you to see her. So we took her from Chad and back to northeast Nigeria.
Mama,
Ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced more than ever before that our most sacred mission, our generation, this Parliament, Africa today, African leaders and world leaders alike, our noblest calling is to bequeath the next generation with a peaceful Africa. We owe this to the likes of Saratu and Hawa to at the very least try, or go down swinging like Fela Kuti, like Madiba, like Bantu Stephen Biko, like Patrice Emery Lumumba, like Sheikh Anta Diop, like Admiral Cabral, Thomas Sankara, or Mam Sheikh Ibrahim. Thank you.